My mother raised her glass at Christmas dinner, praising my sister for buying a house like a real adult. She turned to me with a sweet, sharp smile. "When will you settle down?" I put my fork down. "I already did. Closed on a house last week. Paid in full. I just do not invite those who look down on me." But the biggest shock that night was whose wallet actually funded my sister's home. My name is Madeline Griffin. I am 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my primary function in this family has been utility. I am the silent engine room, the person you call when the math does not add up or the crisis hits, but never the person you invite to stand in the sunlight. It was Christmas night in the snow-draped town of Calder Ridge. The dining room of my mother's house was meticulously staged to resemble a holiday greeting card. Expensive cinnamon and pine candles flickered on the stone mantel, casting a warm, entirely deceptive glow over the 14 people gathered around the massive mahogany table. Soft jazz renditions of classic winter carols drifted from the hidden speakers in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the feast. To an outsider peering through the frosted window panes, it was a flawless picture of loving domesticity. To me, sitting quietly near the end of the table, it was just another stage for my mother, Diane Griffin, to direct her favorite annual play. My mother stood at the head of the table. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a heavy silver spoon, the sharp ringing demanding the absolute attention she felt she naturally deserved. The low hum of family conversation obediently died down. "Family," Diane began, her voice dripping with that specific, practiced affection she reserved for an audience. She raised her glass toward the opposite end of the table, where my younger sister sat glowing in a tailored crimson dress, looking every inch the pampered favorite. "I want to propose a very special toast tonight to my beautiful Tessa and my wonderful son-in-law, Mason. As you all know, they just achieved a massive milestone." Murmurs of approval and scattered applause rippled through the gathered aunts, uncles, and cousins. "They bought a house," Diane continued, her chest swelling with a pride she wore as if it were her own achievement. "A real, permanent home. Tessa has always had such a clear plan, such a wonderful vision for building a proper family life. She has a loving husband, a beautiful property, and she is living like a true, responsible adult." Diane let the adulation wash over her. Then, her eyes tracked down the length of the table, bypassing the floral centerpiece, landing squarely on me. The cultivated warmth vanished from her gaze instantly, replaced by a familiar, piercing judgment. The transition was seamless, a predatory instinct she had honed over decades of family gatherings. "And then, of course, we have Madeline." Diane sighed. The sound was heavy with theatrical, long-suffering disappointment. She tilted her head, her smile turning both sweet and razor-sharp. "Tell us, Madeline, when are you going to finally settle down?" The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of a celebratory toast. It was the tense, expectant hush of a theater audience watching a gladiator step into the arena unarmed. Tessa giggled, a bright, chiming sound, as she swirled her expensive red wine. "Oh, Mom, do not pressure her so much. You know our Madeline. She is perfectly happy hugging her laptop every single night in that tiny little rented apartment of hers. Not everyone is meant for a real life with real commitments." A few of the more distant relatives chuckled nervously. My Uncle Robert cleared his throat loudly and stared with intense fascination at his mashed potatoes. For 33 years, my role in this specific family dynamic had been firmly, immovably established. I was the reliable, boring, slightly pathetic background character. I was the one who was supposed to flush red with embarrassment, look down at my plate, mumble an awkward excuse about being busy with my career, and let them enjoy their collective feeling of superiority. But tonight was different. I did not explode. I did not cry. I did not even break eye contact with the woman who birthed me. I did not ask anyone for permission to exist in my own skin. I simply picked up my heavy silver salad fork and placed it down against the edge of my porcelain plate. The metallic clink rang out sharp and clear. Cutting through the suffocating air of the dining room, I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap. I leaned back in my carved wooden chair and let the silence stretch. I let it stretch until the smug, triumphant smile began to falter on Tessa's face. Until Diane shifted uncomfortably on her designer heels. I let the silence do the heavy lifting, forcing every single pair of eyes among the 14 guests to lock onto me, waiting for the inevitable apology when the tension was thick enough to choke on. I finally spoke. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of anger, devoid of the hurt they were desperately hoping to inflict. "I already settled down," I said. The words sliced cleanly through the heavy atmosphere. Diane blinked rapidly, her wineglass hovering entirely forgotten halfway to her mouth. "Excuse me?" I said, "I already settled down," I repeated, maintaining my steady, unblinking gaze. "I closed on a house last week, a solid property, and I paid for it entirely in cash." I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer weight of that financial reality crash into the room. I just did not feel the need to invite or announce it to people who constantly looked down on me. The entire dining room froze in a state of absolute paralysis. If a napkin had dropped, it would have sounded like a thunderclap. 14 people sat completely immobilized, trapped in a sudden vacuum of air. I watched my Aunt Helen's jaw physically drop open. I saw Mason, Tessa's husband, abruptly stop chewing, his fork suspended in midair. Some faces registered pure, unadulterated disbelief, their expressions screaming that I must be making up a desperate, pathetic lie to save face. Others looked deeply, physically uncomfortable, the tectonic plates of their entire family worldview suddenly shifting violently beneath them. They did not know who or what to believe, but the sheer, unshakable confidence radiating from my posture terrified them. Tessa opened her mouth, her face flushing an ugly, uneven shade of blotchy red, but her vocal cords failed her. Diane looked as though all the air had been violently punched out of her lungs. I looked at each face around the mahogany table, taking my time, committing the exact expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning realization to memory. I looked right at my mother, then right at my sister. "If you all think that is the biggest surprise of the evening," I said, my voice dropping a fraction of an octave, resonating with a cold, hard truth. Not yet. I did not move. I just watched them scramble to process the collapse of their favorite narrative. But the real destruction was still to come. To understand why I said that. To understand the true depth of the betrayal sitting neatly at that dinner table. We have to rewind the clock. We have to go back exactly 10 weeks ago, to a dark, quiet night when my phone rang. That was the night I received a frantic, urgent emergency call from my mother, a plea for salvation that I would later learn was an incredibly well-orchestrated, incredibly expensive lie. At 33 years old, my life outside of those suffocating family gatherings was a quiet, highly structured existence. Professionally, I am the data control team lead at Harbor Grid Risk Systems. It is a demanding, complex role, largely remote and hybrid, requiring me to sift through massive architectures of information, identify vulnerabilities, and prevent systemic collapses. I am paid incredibly well to see patterns that others miss. The bitter irony is that for over a decade, I completely failed to recognize the most toxic, parasitic pattern operating right inside my own life. Despite earning a substantial six-figure salary, my lifestyle was aggressively practical. I rented a modest, perfectly functional one-bedroom apartment in North Briar, a quiet neighborhood far removed from the trendy downtown lofts. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that ran perfectly because I maintained it meticulously. I did not care for designer clothing, and my social media presence was virtually non-existent. Save for the occasional photograph of a hiking trail or a well-plated dinner, because I did not broadcast my life, because I lacked the glittering, performative milestones of engagements, luxury vacations, and matching couple outfits. My family collectively decided I was stagnant. They neatly boxed me into a very specific archetype, In the family mythology, I was the sterile workaholic, good at processing spreadsheets, utterly incapable of actually living. Tessa, naturally, was positioned as my exact opposite. She was the feminine ideal, possessing a warm, vibrant energy that supposedly made her the perfect anchor for a family. My mother nurtured this narrative like a precious garden, because I was deemed the capable but emotionally hollow daughter. My mother's communication with me devolved into pure transaction. When Diane called, she skipped the pleasantries. There was never a preliminary question about my day, my health, or my happiness. I would answer the phone, and within 3 seconds, the crisis was unveiled. It was always a sudden, unavoidable catastrophe. The property taxes had spiked unexpectedly. The foundational support on the back porch was rotting. The medical bills from a minor clinic visit were going to collections. She would deliver the narrative with a breathless, panicked urgency, and then drop the punchline, the exact dollar amount required to make the terror stop. My professional life trained me to trust data over emotion. So I naturally began tracking these interactions. I kept a highly encrypted, hidden spreadsheet on my personal computer. Every time I wired money to my mother or my sister, I logged the transaction. I recorded the exact date. I typed out the requested amount down to the final cent. I noted the specific emergency cited and the method of transfer, whether it was a direct bank wire or an instant payment app, for years. I looked at that growing list of rows and justified the bleeding of my own resources. I told myself I was the load-bearing wall holding our family up. This instinct was born the year my father died. I was only in high school, but I watched my mother crumble, completely paralyzed by the sudden avalanche of grief and administrative horror. Someone had to figure out the life insurance, talk to the mortgage lenders, and keep the lights on. I stepped into the vacuum, and I never really stepped out. I honestly believed that by absorbing their financial shocks, I was protecting them from ruin. Tessa learned to exploit this dynamic just as efficiently as our mother. My sister rarely called just to hear my voice. Her name flashing on my phone screen was a guaranteed harbinger of administrative or financial labor. She would text me blurry, crooked photos of complicated contracts, demanding I read the fine print because she found legal jargon confusing. She would ask me to help structure her household budget, only to ignore my advice completely and reliably. She would call with a soft, pleading voice, explaining that Mason was between jobs again, or an unexpected car repair had drained their checking account. She just needed me to float them a few $100s until the first of the month. The first of the month would arrive, and the debt would magically evaporate from her memory. This division of labor extended to every physical space we shared. At any holiday, any birthday, any casual Sunday dinner, the physical roles were harshly enforced. I was the hired help. I was expected to arrive 2 hours early to arrange the folding chairs, polish the silverware, and chop the vegetables after the meal, while the rest of the family migrated to the living room with their wine glasses. I was left standing over the kitchen sink, scrubbing grease off roasting pans until the skin on my hands turned raw and wrinkled. Tessa would be on the sofa, bathed in the soft glow of the lamps, laughing loudly, receiving endless compliments on her outfit and her glowing complexion. She was the featured attraction. I was the stagehand, completely invisible unless something broke and needed fixing. What none of them knew, what I guarded with intense, almost paranoid secrecy, was the sheer size of the wealth I was quietly accumulating. I had a massive, robust savings account and a diverse investment portfolio. I did not hide this out of a desire to be deceptive. I hid it because it was a matter of basic survival. Experience had violently taught me that in my family, any available capital I possessed instantly mutated into someone else's life or death emergency. If Diane even suspected I had received a year-end bonus, the roof would suddenly develop a catastrophic leak. If Tessa found out I got a promotion, her heating system would miraculously fail in the dead of winter. My silence was not a weapon, it was a shield. I knew that the moment they realized I had actual wealth, they would not stop until they had drained every single drop. So, I stayed in my quiet apartment in North Briar, driving my old car, watching the numbers on my spreadsheet grow. Entirely unaware that the biggest theft of my life was already in motion. The architecture of a dysfunctional family is rarely built overnight. It is constructed slowly, brick by heavy brick, usually beginning on the worst day of your life. I noted earlier that my father's death was the catalyst for my role as the financial caretaker, but to truly comprehend the absolute permanence of that trap, you have to look closely at how the grief was distributed in our house. I was exactly 15 years old when his heart simply stopped. It was sudden, brutal, and world-shattering. In the immediate aftermath, the house descended into a heavy, suffocating darkness. My mother entirely collapsed. She retreated into her bedroom, pulling the curtains shut, paralyzed not just by the emotional devastation, but by the terrifying reality of the adult world crashing down on her. The mortgage, the medical bills, the utility notices, the confusing stack of life insurance documents, they piled up on the kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Tessa was older, legally an adult, but she was immediately granted immunity from the crisis. The family consensus, driven heavily by my mother's protective instincts, was that Tessa was far too sensitive to handle the harsh realities of death and debt. She was delicate. She needed to be shielded so her bright spirit would not be crushed. So at 15, I became the designated survivor. While my sister cried in the arms of visiting relatives, I sat at the dining room table with a cheap calculator and a notebook. I was the teenager dialing the toll-free numbers for the life insurance company, navigating endless automated menus, and learning how to speak to claims adjusters. I was the one opening the final notices from collection agencies, my stomach twisting into tight knots as I tried to decipher interest rates and grace periods. I learned to fill the massive, terrifying spaces that the adults in my life had suddenly abandoned. From that specific trauma, our roles were locked into concrete. I became the designated crisis manager. Tessa became the precious cargo that needed to be kept peaceful at all costs. In those early years, I was fueled by a desperate, foolish childhood hope. I genuinely believed that once the worst of the storm passed, my mother would emerge from her grief, look around, and finally see me. I thought she would recognize the crushing weight I had carried to keep our lives from disintegrating. I thought my competence would finally earn me the warmth and affection she poured so effortlessly over Tessa. But competence does not breed affection in a toxic ecosystem. It only breeds reliance. The temporary role of the responsible daughter slowly mutated into an infinite, inescapable obligation. The most glaring proof of this transition happened years later, when Tessa married Mason Cole. Tessa, naturally, envisioned a wedding that far exceeded anything our mother could actually afford. A month before the ceremony, the budget catastrophically collapsed. The venue demanded their final payment, the catering costs had doubled, and my mother was in a state of absolute panic. She cornered me in my apartment, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. She begged me to cover a massive shortfall, a sum amounting to thousands of dollars that I had spent 3 grueling years saving from my first corporate job. It was framed as an absolute necessity to save Tessa's special day. My mother held my hands and looked me right in the eyes, her voice trembling with conviction. She swore to me it was just a temporary bridge loan. She promised that as soon as the wedding gifts were counted and the dust settled, she and Tessa would pay me back every single cent. She played on my deepest vulnerabilities, claiming that my father would have wanted me to step up for my sister. I transferred the funds the next morning. Tessa got her perfect, glowing wedding day. She danced under expensive lighting and drank premium champagne. And then, the debt simply ceased to exist in the weeks, months, and years that followed. Neither my mother nor my sister ever mentioned it again. It was completely erased from their collective memory. When I cautiously tried to bring it up a year later, my mother acted deeply offended, accusing me of being petty and trying to ruin a beautiful family memory over something as vulgar as money. Over the following decade, this became the standard operating procedure. Every single request for financial support was expertly wrapped in a thick, suffocating layer of moral manipulation. When a tire blew out, when a tax bill was ignored, when a medical deductible could not be met. The demands were never phrased as simple loans. They were presented as fundamental tests of my character. I was told I had to do it for the family. I was reminded of everything my mother supposedly sacrificed to raise us. I was guilted about how hard my younger sister was struggling while I sat comfortably in my corporate job. But the money was not the thing that caused the deepest, most agonizing pain. The money was just math. The true devastation lay in the stories my mother told. At every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every casual neighborhood barbecue, my mother would hold court in the living room. She would cast herself in the heroic role of the ultimate single mother. With tears glistening in her eyes, she would tell my aunts, uncles, and family friends how she single-handedly kept a roof over our heads after my father died. She would detail the supposed sleepless nights she spent balancing the budget, the invisible mountains she moved to ensure Tessa had a beautiful wedding and a perfect start to her adult life. I would sit in the corner of the room, completely silent, listening to her rewrite history. The woman who could not bring herself to open a utility bill when I was 15 was now claiming credit for every single financial victory I had secured for us. My mother was building a martyr complex using bricks bought entirely with my money. I began to notice the grim reality of my existence within the family structure. The more I sacrificed, the more invisible I became. I was no longer treated as a human being with my own desires, fears, or future. I was taken for absolute granted. My actual presence faded into the background, leaving behind nothing but my designated function. I was a safety net. I was an emergency fund. I was the structural support system designed to keep the main house standing, completely unacknowledged unless the foundation started to crack. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy my way into my own family, trying to prove my worth through utility. I did not realize I was being used as a resource until a lie was transferred into my mother's account. The events that finally shattered my blind compliance began on a Tuesday evening in late October. I had just closed my work laptop after a brutal 14-hour session analyzing complex data migration errors for a major corporate client. My eyes burned, and my neck was a solid knot of pure tension. I was halfway to my kitchen to pour a glass of tap water when my mobile phone vibrated sharply against the granite counter. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered the call, fully expecting the usual rapid-fire demand for assistance. Instead, I was met with a theatrical, breathless panic. My mother sounded as though she was gripping the edge of a table to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She launched into a terrifying narrative about a surprise visit from the city housing inspector. According to her frantic explanation, the entire structural integrity of her back deck was compromised. The main support joists were completely rotted through, a hidden danger lurking beneath the seemingly solid surface wood. She claimed the city inspector had slapped a bright red violation sticker on her back door and threatened her with massive daily fines if the hazard was not rectified immediately. She went on to explain that she had frantically called an emergency contractor and a structural engineer. They could squeeze her into their schedule the very next day, thereby avoiding the city penalties, but they required an upfront, non-refundable deposit to secure the lumber and the expedited permits. The number she quoted to me was precise and heavy, $5,800. I rubbed my temples, trying to process the sudden catastrophe through my exhaustion. I calmly asked if she could send me a photograph of the inspector's report so I could read exactly what needed to be reinforced. That logical request was met with immediate, defensive hostility. She snapped that she did not have time to scan and email bureaucratic documents while her house was practically falling down around her. Then came the familiar, heavy anchor of guilt. Her voice dropped to a trembling, fragile whisper. She asked me to imagine her walking out onto that deck to water her hanging plants, the rotting wood snapping violently beneath her weight. If I fall through that deck and break my hip, or worse, could you honestly live with yourself? Madeline? She asked, her voice cracking perfectly on my name. Knowing you had the money to fix it and chose to interrogate me over paperwork? It was a masterclass in emotional extortion. I was simply too exhausted to fight her, too drained to interrogate the obvious inconsistencies in her story. At exactly 8 in the morning the following day, I logged into my secure banking portal. I initiated a direct wire transfer of $5,800 to her primary checking account. Then, I opened my encrypted spreadsheet. I created a new row. I typed the date, the exact dollar amount, and logged the reason precisely as she had presented it. Deck and foundation emergency. Exactly 14 days later, the first seed of genuine, undeniable suspicion was planted. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was drinking black coffee and scrolling mindlessly through my social media feed. Suddenly, a photograph stopped my thumb completely still on the glass screen. It was a picture of my sister, Tessa, and her husband, Mason. They were standing on the manicured front lawn of a beautiful 2-story colonial house with fresh white trim. They were both glowing with triumph, holding a large, novelty cardboard key between them. The caption beneath the photo was lengthy, filled with celebratory icons and self-congratulatory praise about their difficult journey to homeownership. But it was the final sentence that hooked into my brain and violently refused to let go. Tessa had written, "Cleared our final inspection yesterday and officially closed. I am so incredibly blessed to have a mother who always saves me right at the buzzer. Always saves me. Right at the buzzer." I stared at those specific words until the letters began to blur together. My analytical mind immediately flashed to the $5,800 that had left my account exactly 2 weeks prior. A sudden structural emergency, an immediate, non-negotiable demand for cash, a tight deadline. I tried to force the ugly, cynical thought away. I paced around my small living room, actively trying to rationalize the situation. I told myself it was just a bizarre, unfortunate coincidence. Perhaps my mother had her own secret reserve of cash she used to help Tessa with her closing costs. Perhaps Tessa was merely referring to emotional support. A maternal pep talk given when the mortgage underwriting process became stressful. I desperately wanted to believe that my mother would not fabricate a dangerous physical hazard to extract $5,800 from me, only to hand it directly over to my sister for a down payment. But the doubt had already taken root in the dark corners of my mind. That afternoon, the family group chat transformed into an unbearable digital parade. My phone pinged relentlessly as aunts, uncles, and cousins poured out their congratulations. My mother was leading the charge, sending long, glowing paragraphs about how intensely proud she was of Tessa. She repeatedly emphasized how fiercely independent Tessa and Mason were, praising them for saving every single penny for their new home entirely on their own, painting them as the ultimate modern success story. I watched the text messages scroll by in absolute silence. Then, a rare interruption occurred. My Aunt Sarah, a distant relative who lived 3 states away and rarely engaged in the daily family drama, chimed into the chat after offering her warm congratulations to Tessa. She sent a second, separate message. "That is wonderful news," Aunt Sarah wrote. "How is Madeline doing these days? We have not heard about her in a while." I sat on my sofa and watched my screen, holding my breath. 1 minute passed, then 3 minutes, then 5 minutes. The group chat, which had been firing off celebratory messages every few seconds, suddenly went dead silent. It was as if Aunt Sarah had spoken an unforgivable profanity. Nobody answered. My mother did not offer a polite, generic update about my job. Tessa did not acknowledge the question. After 10 excruciating minutes of digital dead air, my mother finally sent a new message. It was a link to an expensive online furniture catalog, asking the family to vote on which velvet sectional sofa Tessa should purchase for her new living room. The conversation immediately and violently pivoted to upholstery options. Aunt Sarah's question was buried, pushed completely off the screen, effectively erased from existence. Once again, I was deleted from the family narrative the very moment I ceased to be a useful resource. The anger that washed over me was not hot, loud, or explosive. It was cold, sharp, and intensely clarifying. That night, long after the traffic outside my window had died down. I did not go to bed. The pale blue light from my dual monitors illuminated my small home office. On the left screen, I pulled up Tessa's public social media profile. I began scrolling back through months of posts, noting the exact dates of her luxury vacations, her new car purchase, and her occasional complaints about sudden, unexpected expenses. On the right screen, I opened my heavily encrypted tracking file. I sat perfectly still in my desk chair, the silence of my apartment wrapping around me. For the very first time in my adult life, I stopped looking at my financial transfers as isolated incidents of familial duty. I began to look at them as pure data points. I leaned forward, placed my hands firmly on the keyboard, and began to compare the dates of my mother's terrifying emergencies with the timeline of my sister's perfect, subsidized life. My profession revolves around the absolute certainty of raw information. People lie, but metadata never does. When you want to find a discrepancy in a complex system, you do not ask the user for their feelings, you look at the logs. The following morning, I bypassed my usual routine. I sat at my home workstation, opened a secure browser window, and navigated directly to the county government's public permit and inspection portal. It is a clunky, outdated database, but it is completely transparent. If a city inspector flags a structural violation, a public record is automatically generated. If a contractor pulls a permit for major repair work on a residential property, it is logged and categorized for anyone to see. I typed my mother's home address into the search bar. I set the date parameters to cover the last 6 months, specifically highlighting the week she claimed the city inspector had placed a red violation tag on her back door. I hit the enter key. The screen flashed briefly before returning the result. 0 records found. There was no structural violation. There was no emergency permit pulled for deck reinforcement. The city had absolutely no record of any inspector visiting her property during that time frame. My mother's terrifying, tearful story, the one that had cost me $5,800, was a complete fabrication. My hands hovered over the keyboard. A strange, clinical calm washed over me. I cleared the search fields. Then, I typed in the address of the colonial house Tessa had just purchased. The system processed the query for a few seconds. A list of recent activities populated the screen. My eyes scanned the rows until they locked onto a specific entry. It was a supplementary appraisal and rushed structural clearance inspection. The status was marked as resolved. I looked at the date the fee was paid. It was processed exactly 48 hours after I had wired the money to my mother's checking account. The pieces were beginning to snap together. But my training demanded thorough verification. I needed a secondary source. During her panicked phone call, my mother had specifically named the engineering firm she had supposedly contacted. She had used their name to add weight to her lie, assuming I would never bother to follow up. I found their number online and dialed it. A polite administrative assistant answered. I used my most professional corporate voice, introducing myself as a financial representative verifying an invoice for Diane Griffin. I asked if they had a scheduled work order or a finalized contract on file for her address. The assistant clicked through her system. She confirmed that a woman matching my mother's description had indeed called their office earlier that month to request a preliminary quote for foundation reinforcement. However, she clearly stated that no site visit was ever booked and no contract was ever signed. Then, the assistant offered a detail that felt like a physical blow. She mentioned that the caller had been incredibly anxious, asking repeatedly about payment milestones and whether the required inspection documentation could be expedited. The caller had explicitly stated she needed the paperwork pushed through immediately to avoid delaying the final approval process with her bank. You do not worry about a bank's final approval process when you are fixing a deck you have owned for 20 years. You worry about a bank's approval process when you are trying to close on a new mortgage. I thanked the assistant and ended the call. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I turned back to my dual monitors. I opened my encrypted ledger. I expanded the window, filling the entire screen with the history of my financial bleed. I began pulling up Tessa's digital footprint on the other monitor. Cross-referencing years of social media posts against my bank transfer dates, the patterns emerged instantly, stark and undeniable. 2 years ago, my mother had a sudden, catastrophic plumbing failure that required $3,200 that exact same month. Tessa posted photos of a brand-new, custom-built outdoor kitchen 4 years ago. My mother needed $4,500 to cover a supposedly massive, unexpected tax reassessment on her property. 3 weeks later, Tessa and Mason drove home in a brand-new, imported luxury sport utility vehicle. Last spring, it was a sudden medical deductible for a mysterious heart flutter my mother claimed to have. That money perfectly aligned with Tessa's 2-week anniversary vacation to a high-end resort in the Caribbean. For years, I had been funding my sister's extravagant lifestyle. Laundered through my mother's fabricated tragedies, I did not scream. I did not throw anything across the room. The deep, aching hurt that had defined my relationship with my family simply evaporated, replaced by a glacial, protective ice. This was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was not a mother occasionally favoring one child over another. This was a highly structured, deliberate system of financial abuse. They had weaponized my sense of duty, turning my grief and my desperate desire for family stability into a steady, reliable revenue stream. I pressed the print command. The laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out 3 pages of tightly packed data. I took the pages to my kitchen island. I grabbed a bright yellow highlighting marker. Slowly, methodically, I drew a thick, neon line connecting every single one of my mother's emergencies to my sister's luxury acquisitions. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at the pages. The truth was violently bright. I had been their personal bank vault, unlocking my doors every time they whispered a lie. I folded the printed timeline neatly and slid it into a heavy manila envelope. I would not call them. I would not send an angry text message. Confronting them now, with only raw anger and printed spreadsheets, would give them room to maneuver. They would twist the narrative, call me paranoid, and accuse me of invading their privacy. They were experts at rewriting reality. I needed to lock all the doors before they even realized they were trapped. I would not confront them right away. I needed one more piece of the puzzle, the piece that would make it impossible for them to call me crazy. I needed someone who understood the architecture of bureaucracy. That person was my father's older sister, Elise Rowan. Aunt Elise was a woman in her late 60s who had spent 4 decades working deep inside the County Hall of Records before taking an early retirement. She was not the type of aunt who baked cookies or offered warm, useless platitudes when you were hurting. She was a woman of incredibly few words, possessing a mind like a steel trap and an unmatched fluency in the language of municipal paperwork. I drove to her modest house on the outskirts of town and placed the thick manila envelope onto her kitchen table. I did not cry. I simply pulled out the highlighted spreadsheets, the printed social media posts, and the notes from my phone calls. I laid out the entire timeline, specifically focusing on the recent transfer of $5,800 and the immediate subsequent approval of Tessa's property inspection. I explained how my mother and sister expertly managed their public image before our relatives, painting themselves as independent warriors while secretly mining my bank accounts. Elise put on her reading glasses. She did not gasp or express theatrical shock. She methodically reviewed every single page. Where a normal relative might have offered emotional outrage, Elise offered surgical precision. She pointed at my printed screenshot of the permit portal. She showed me how to properly cross-reference the parcel identification numbers to ensure there was absolutely no margin for administrative error. She helped me definitively separate my own lingering emotional speculation from the concrete, undeniable legal evidence. We tracked the flow of the lies perfectly. She proved to me that I was not crazy, and I was not overreacting. When she reached the final page, she took off her glasses and folded her hands over the documents. She looked at me with the exact same practical, unyielding eyes my father used to have. She knew exactly how my mother and sister operated. I asked her what my next move should be. expecting her to suggest a legal route or a massive, dramatic family confrontation. Instead, Elise delivered the most important piece of advice I had ever received. She told me not to act on impulse. She told me that arguing with people committed to a delusion is a waste of breath. "You do not need to make noise," Elise said, her voice perfectly even. "You just need to stand where the truth can hear itself." That singular sentence unlocked something fundamental inside my brain. For the past 8 months, I had been quietly, almost passively, hunting for a house. I had toured dozens of properties, but had always hesitated to make an offer. Paralyzed by the subconscious fear that draining my savings would leave me unable to rescue my family during their next inevitable catastrophe. Now, looking at the clear proof of their systemic manipulation, that fear completely evaporated. The toxic loop was broken. I decided to finalize my own escape plan immediately. I bypassed the sprawling, flashy colonial homes that people like Tessa craved. I zeroed in on a property I had bookmarked weeks ago, a sturdy, practical brick duplex located in the quiet, working-class neighborhood of West Halden. It was a remarkably intelligent piece of real estate. The layout was split perfectly down the middle. I would live in one half, and I would lease out the other half to a long-term tenant. It would generate a steady, reliable stream of passive income. It was close to the highway I used for my hybrid office commute, and the structural bones of the building were absolutely flawless. It was the exact definition of settling down in a mature, sustainable manner. Best of all, the asking price aligned perfectly with my financial reality. If I combined my heavily guarded investment savings with the substantial corporate bonus I had accumulated over the past 3 years, I could cover the entire cost. I would not need a 30-year mortgage. I would not owe the bank a single cent. I submitted an aggressive, all-cash offer the very next morning. It was accepted within 24 hours. I initiated the closing process with absolute, airtight secrecy. I told no one except Aunt Elise. I did not post cryptic updates on my social media accounts. I did not drop subtle hints into the relentless family group chat. I had spent my entire life watching my mother and sister use material possessions as weapons to prove their superiority and demand validation from the world. I had zero interest in playing their game. This duplex was not a prop to show off at the next holiday gathering. It was a fortress. 2 weeks later, I sat in the sterile, brightly lit conference room of a local title agency. I signed my name across dozens of legal documents, the blue ink binding me to a piece of the earth that belonged entirely to me. The escrow officer handed me a heavy brass key ring. I drove directly to West Halden and unlocked the heavy wooden front door of my new home. I stepped inside the empty living room. There was no furniture, no art on the walls, just the smell of fresh paint and polished hardwood floors. I closed the door behind me, letting the heavy deadbolt slide into place with a solid, metallic click. I walked to the center of the room and spoke a single word out loud, just to hear it. The sound bounced off the bare brick walls, echoing back to me. For the first time in 33 years, the silence surrounding me did not feel like an erasure. It did not feel like being forgotten or ignored. It felt like absolute, untouchable ownership. The weeks leading up to late December were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Having successfully secured her new property, my sister became the undisputed saint of the family group chat. My mother was her tireless public relations manager, almost daily. My phone screen would light up with notifications detailing Tessa's domestic triumphs. There were photos of customized window treatments, lengthy debates about paint swatches for the guest bathroom, and constant, thinly veiled comparisons. My mother would type things like, "Tessa truly knows how to build a warm, inviting nest for her family, while some people just do not have that maternal instinct to settle down." I ignored the bait. I was busy ordering appliances for my duplex and interviewing prospective tenants for the second unit. 10 days before the holiday, the official summons arrived. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening. She did not ask about my week or inquire if I had any existing plans. She launched straight into logistics. She informed me that dinner would be served at exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Day, which meant she expected me to arrive no later than noon. She rattled off a list of chores as if she were reading a restaurant prep sheet. I was assigned to polish the silver, peel 10 pounds of potatoes, assemble the complicated centerpieces, and handle all the heavy lifting in the kitchen while she and Tessa entertained the early arrivals. It was the exact same script we had followed for over a decade, but I was no longer playing my assigned character. "I cannot do that," I said, my voice completely flat and relaxed. "I will arrive at 6 o'clock, right when dinner is served." Just like the rest of the guests, the line went dead silent for 3 full seconds. The sheer audacity of a polite refusal simply did not compute in her brain. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from commanding to dangerously sharp. She demanded to know what could possibly be more important than helping my own flesh and blood prepare for a sacred holiday. "I have other commitments this year," I replied. "I am happy to bring a dessert, but I will not be there to set up." Right on cue, my mother deployed her ultimate weapon. Her voice broke, taking on a fragile, trembling quality. She told me how exhausted she was. She sighed heavily into the receiver and said it broke her heart to see how selfish I had become. She whispered that if my father were still alive, he would be profoundly ashamed of how little I cared about holding this family together. In the past, the mere mention of my father's disappointment would have crushed my chest. I would have instantly caved, apologizing profusely, and promised to arrive at 11 in the morning just to prove my devotion. This time, I felt nothing but a profound, clinical pity for her lack of imagination. It was such a lazy tactic. "I miss him too," I said smoothly, refusing to engage with the guilt. "I will see you at 6 o'clock on Christmas. Goodbye." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button to end the call. I did not wait for her to sputter a response. I did not sit in the dark and ruminate over her cruel words. Cutting that emotional leash felt less like a dramatic explosion and more like quietly dropping a heavy bag of rocks I'd been carrying up a mountain for years. 2 days later, the chessboard shifted again. A text message vibrated on my screen. It was from Tessa. The message was brief and wrapped in her signature false innocence. She claimed Mason was buried in work, and she had received a confusing letter from her mortgage lender. She asked if her brilliant, data-savvy older sister could just take a quick peek at the jargon and translate it for her. Attached to the text was a photograph of a heavily folded document. It was deliberately angled and tightly cropped, clearly attempting to obscure the bulk of the text. She only wanted me to read one specific paragraph about escrow adjustments. She severely underestimated my professional eye. I did not need to read the fine print. My eyes were immediately drawn to the very top left corner of the page, where the bank's departmental letterhead was partially visible. It was not a standard correspondence logo. It clearly stated the name of the department, Loss Mitigation. In the financial sector, you do not receive letters from the Loss Mitigation Department when your accounts are in good standing. You get transferred to Loss Mitigation when you have missed consecutive payments, when your escrow is violently overdrawn, or when the bank is initiating early pre-foreclosure protocols. The reality of the situation clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The $5,800 she extracted from me through our mother's fake patio emergency was not just extra cash for decorative pillows. It was a desperate, last-minute Band-Aid to stop a massive financial hemorrhage. Tessa was drowning. Her entire picture-perfect life, the grand colonial house, the luxury cars, the constant boasting, was a hollow shell built on massive, unmanageable debt. The old version of Madeline would have panicked. I would have immediately called her, demanded the full truth, drafted a strict budget spreadsheet, and likely offered a massive cash injection from my own savings to protect her from ruin. I would have played the savior, completely ignoring my own needs. I looked at the cropped image on my screen. I felt the familiar pull of obligation, the deeply ingrained instinct to fix the broken thing. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and let the instinct die. I opened the keyboard on my phone. I did not ask for the full document. I did not offer a single piece of free financial consulting. I did not tell her I knew exactly what department had sent that letter. I typed a simple sentence. "This looks complicated. You should really sit down and read this completely with your husband." I hit send and tossed my phone onto my new empty kitchen counter. The tension in the air was thickening, turning solid as the end of December rapidly approached. I knew with absolute certainty that the upcoming dinner at my mother's house was going to be a collision. The fake smiles, the forced toasts, the aggressive comparisons, they were all loaded into the chamber, ready to be fired. But as I stood in the quiet warmth of my own brick duplex, surrounded by walls I owned free and clear, I realized the most empowering truth of all. I did not need to prepare a grand theatrical speech. I did not need to scream or cry or try to convince them of my worth. I did not need to win an argument. I just needed to show up, sit at their table, and simply refuse to participate in their lies for one more minute. The truth was heavy enough to break the table entirely on its own. The collision of two entirely different realities often happens in the most mundane locations. For me, the final, explosive piece of the puzzle was delivered under the flickering fluorescent lights of a local grocery store, right in the middle of the produce section. Just 3 days before Christmas, I was inspecting a display of organic apples when a familiar, overly bright voice called my name. I turned to see Pam Whitaker maneuvering her shopping cart toward me. Pam was a fixture in my mother's social circle, a boisterous woman with heavily sprayed hair who also happened to be the premier independent home insurance broker for our entire county. She was exactly the kind of person who viewed confidentiality as a mere suggestion rather than a professional mandate. Pam greeted me with a tight hug that smelled of strong floral perfume and peppermint gum. She immediately launched into a rapid-fire update about her grandchildren, her holiday baking schedule, and her recent bout with winter allergies. I nodded politely, offering brief, non-committal responses, waiting for the conversational wave to recede so I could return to my errands. Then, she casually dropped a live grenade right at my feet. "You know, you really need to tell your mother she's an absolute saint," Pam said, adjusting her heavy silk scarf. "I mean, I always knew Diane was a dedicated mother, but what she did for Tessa last month was just incredibly generous." I kept my facial expression completely neutral. I relaxed my shoulders and offered a mild, inquiring smile. "She certainly tries to help. What happened exactly?" Pam leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, thrilled to share what she assumed was common family knowledge. "Oh, well, I probably should not say too much about the underwriting side, but Tessa's homeowner's insurance policy was dangerously close to a complete lapse. They had missed 2 consecutive premium cycles. If that policy had canceled, it would have triggered a catastrophic default clause on her new mortgage. Her whole closing process would have completely collapsed." Pam shook her head, letting out a dramatic sigh. "It was down to the absolute wire. We were 24 hours away from issuing the final cancellation notice. But then, boom, your mother marches into my office and drops a massive lump sum payment to bring the entire account current and prepay the next 6 months. Save Tessa's house right at the buzzer." Save Tessa's house right at the buzzer. It was the exact phrase my sister had used on her social media post. I did not flinch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a heavy rhythmic drumbeat of pure adrenaline, but my face remained a mask of polite gratitude. I thanked Pam for her hard work, wished her a wonderful holiday, and smoothly walked away. I abandoned my shopping basket in the next aisle. I drove straight home in absolute silence. The moment I stepped inside my apartment, I opened my encrypted ledger. I did not just look at the recent transaction. I went deeper. I pulled county tax schedules, standard escrow analysis dates, and property insurance renewal cycles. I cross-referenced the dates of my mother's frantic, tearful requests for cash against the rigid deadlines of municipal and financial institutions. The results were chilling. I found 3 distinct, undeniable matches. A fabricated dental emergency my mother claimed to suffer 2 years ago aligned perfectly with the exact week property taxes were due for the county. A supposedly broken water heater last winter mirrored the exact date of a massive escrow shortage notice. The financial crisis was not a recent development. My money had been systematically siphoned for years to plug the endless, gaping holes in my sister's sinking ship. I was not just an emergency fund, I was an active participant in a massive financial cover-up. Unknowingly underwriting an illusion of wealth. I printed these new findings and immediately drove to Aunt Elise's house. We sat at her kitchen table, the air thick with focused energy. Elise took my messy pile of highlighted papers and began to construct a master timeline. She used a thick black marker on a large piece of poster board. On the left side, she wrote the date, the amount requested, and the specific emergency my mother had tearfully described. In the center, she documented the exact date the funds left my bank account. On the right side, she attached the corresponding proof, the county tax deadline, the insurance payment receipt Pam had just verbally confirmed, the social media posts of luxury vacations. When she finished, the board looked like a forensic accounting map used in a corporate fraud investigation. It was airtight. It was entirely undeniable. Elise tapped the cap of the marker against the table, drawing my attention. "Listen to me very carefully, Madeline," she said, her tone authoritative and grounded. "When you walk into that dining room tomorrow, your instinct will be to pull out these papers and read them a list of their sins. You will want to scream. You will want to watch them panic." She leaned forward, locking eyes with me. "Do not do that. You do not bring a sword to a dinner party. If you act like a prosecutor, they will instantly play the victims. They will accuse you of being cruel, of ruining Christmas, of aggressively investigating your own flesh and blood. They will make your reaction the problem, instead of their theft." I absorbed her words, understanding the psychological trap she was warning me about. "Then how do I handle it?" "You set the rules of engagement," Elise instructed. "You do not volunteer anything. You sit at that table, and you wait. Your mother will inevitably try to humiliate you. She will ask you a condescending question to elevate Tessa. When she does, you answer the specific question. You use plain facts. You use a steady voice. You do not insult them. You do not yell. And you do not try to win their approval. You simply state the truth to officially resign from your position as their emotional and financial automated teller machine." I drove back to my apartment and began packing. I did not want to wake up on Christmas morning surrounded by the ghosts of my old life. I filled 2 heavy cardboard boxes with the items that brought me the most peace. A collection of crystal water glasses I had bought in Europe, a heavy brass desk lamp, and a worn leather reading chair that fit my posture perfectly. I loaded them into my car and drove across town to the brick duplex in West Halden. The winter air was sharp and biting as I carried the items inside. I placed the leather chair near the front window. I set the brass lamp on a small wooden side table. I carefully unpacked the crystal glasses and arranged them on the pristine kitchen counter. The contrast was stark and deeply profound. Tomorrow night, I would be sitting at a dining table overflowing with expensive silver, towering floral arrangements, and 14 people actively participating in a shared delusion. But right now, standing in this empty, quiet space, I possessed something far more valuable than a perfect holiday aesthetic. I possessed reality. This brick, this wood, this quiet air, it was all authentic. It was purchased with honest labor, free from manipulation, free from guilt. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the concrete porch. I pulled the door shut, listening to the heavy, satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding into the reinforced frame. I dropped the brass key into the deep pocket of my wool coat, letting my fingers trace its jagged edges. I looked out at the quiet, snow-covered street. Tomorrow, the performance would finally end. Tomorrow, if they asked me when I was going to settle down, I would answer with the absolute truth. I pulled my car into the driveway at exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas evening. The digital clock on my dashboard flipped from 5:59, and I turned off the ignition. For over a decade, I had always arrived at least 3 hours prior to any major holiday gathering, acting as the unpaid caterer and event coordinator. Tonight, The windows of my mother's house were already glowing bright gold against the dark. Snow-covered lawn. I could hear the muffled sound of 14 people laughing and talking through the heavy oak front door. I rang the doorbell and waited. My mother pulled the door open. She was wearing a deep green velvet dress, her hair perfectly styled, holding an empty crystal wine glass. She did not smile. She did not wish me a Merry Christmas. She immediately launched into her customary barrage of demands. She told me I was late, ignoring the fact that the invitation explicitly stated dinner was at 6. She pointed toward the kitchen, instructing me to get the heavy linen napkins from the bottom drawer of the mahogany cabinet and to unfold the extra wooden chairs for the far end of the table. It was the exact same script she had used for years, assuming I would instantly drop my coat and scurry to the back of the house to manage the logistics no one else wanted to touch. I stepped over the threshold and calmly closed the front door behind me. I did not apologize. I unbuttoned my wool coat, hung it neatly on the brass rack in the foyer, and looked her right in the eyes. "The table looks lovely, Mother," I said, my voice pleasant and entirely unbothered. "I brought a bottle of red wine. Where should I sit?" Diane stared at me, her mouth slightly parted in genuine confusion. The cognitive dissonance of her reliable workhorse refusing to wear the harness was short-circuiting her brain. Before she could formulate a reprimand, I walked right past her. I bypassed the kitchen entirely. I walked straight into the crowded, fragrant living room, greeted a few aunts and uncles, and deliberately took a seat on the comfortable sofa right next to Aunt Elise. I claimed my space not as the household staff, but as a completely equal guest. Elise gave me a single, approving nod. The battle lines were officially drawn. An hour later, we were all seated around the massive dining table. The candles were burning low, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and heavy perfumes. Right as the main courses were being cleared to make way for dessert, Diane stood up and tapped her spoon against her glass. She delivered her grand, theatrical toast. She showered Tessa and Mason with extravagant praise, practically weeping with joy over their new house. She leaned heavily on specific phrases, praising them for building a proper, respectable foundation. She emphasized the words real life and real home, casting a very deliberate, pointed glance in my direction to ensure the entire table understood who was lacking those exact things. Then came the transition. Diane turned her head, fixing me with a smile that was equal parts sweet and venomous. She projected her voice so every single relative could hear. "And what about you, Madeline?" she asked, her tone dripping with mock concern. "When will you finally settle down?" Tessa, sitting securely next to her husband, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. She told the table that it was a shame I spent my entire life hugging my laptop in my tiny rented apartment. She questioned the point of my miserable existence, asking loudly what good all my penny-pinching did if I refused to participate in the real world. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not shrink back into my chair. I simply set my heavy silver fork down on the edge of my porcelain plate. I looked at Tessa, then at my mother, and I spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity. I told them I had already settled down. I announced that I had closed on a solid brick duplex in West Halden just last week. I stated clearly that the property was paid for in cash. The title was fully signed, and the only reason I had kept it a secret was that I had absolutely no desire to submit my personal achievements for their petty grading system. A suffocating silence descended over the 14 people at the table. The sheer force of the revelation hit them like a physical wave. Diane let out a short, breathy laugh, her eyes darting around the room, desperately trying to gauge if I was playing a cruel prank. Then, she made the ultimate, fatal error. The mask of the caring mother slipped entirely. "A duplex?" Diane scoffed, her voice shrill and accusatory. "Paid in cash? Where on earth did you get that kind of money?" It was a beautiful, damning question, by asking it in front of our entire extended family. She publicly confirmed the very premise of my silence. She proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that she knew absolutely nothing about her eldest daughter's career, success, or capabilities outside of my utility as a walking checkbook. I held her gaze and answered with cold, hard data. I briefly listed my position as a data control team lead, the annual corporate bonuses I had steadily banked, and the aggressive financial discipline I maintained while driving a 10-year-old car and living below my means. But saving the money was not actually the hardest part, I continued, letting my voice drop slightly so they had to strain to listen. The hardest part was trying to build my own future while constantly having to rescue you from fabricated financial emergencies. The word fabricated hung in the air like smoke. Diane's face drained of color. She slammed her hand down on the table, the silverware rattling violently. She ordered me to stop speaking, her voice trembling with sudden, unmasked panic. Tessa jumped in, her face flushing an angry, defensive red. "You are completely out of line. Madeline, stop being so dramatic and trying to ruin my night just because you are jealous." "I am not being dramatic." "Tessa," I replied, my eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "I am being precise. 10 weeks ago, Mother called me in tears. She claimed the city was going to heavily fine her for a rotting back porch. She demanded $5,800 for an immediate, non-refundable contractor deposit." I paused, looking around the table at my aunts and uncles, who were now staring at Diane with wide, horrified eyes. "There was no city inspector," I stated firmly. "There was no rotting porch. That specific $5,800 went directly to bringing your homeowner's insurance current. Tessa, it paid your severely delinquent premium so your lender would not halt your closing at the last minute. And I do not just suspect this. I have the entire timeline." The heavy silence at the table was finally broken by my mother's nervous, high-pitched laughter. She waved her hand dismissively, her eyes darting toward the relatives. "Oh, Madeline, you are so dramatic. You have completely misunderstood the situation. Family helps family. There was a slight mix-up with the porch contractor, and I just temporarily reallocated those funds to help your sister with a tiny administrative hiccup." Before I could even respond to that pathetic spin, an unexpected voice chimed in from 2 seats down. It was Pam Whitaker, the insurance broker I had run into at the grocery store. Pam was a regular holiday guest, and in her eagerness to defend her friend, she completely missed the tension in the room. "It was not a tiny administrative hiccup, Diane," Pam said loudly, raising her wine glass. "I was just telling Madeline the other day. It was a massive crisis. If you had not rushed into my office with that lump sum cash payment last month, Tessa's entire homeowner's policy would have canceled. Her new mortgage would have collapsed right there on the underwriter's desk." Pam beamed, thinking she was proving my mother's heroism. Instead, she detonated the final bomb. At the far end of the table, Mason physically recoiled, the color completely drained from his face. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. "What cancellation notice?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tessa, what is Pam talking about? I gave you the money for the insurance escrow 3 months ago." Tessa shrank back into her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "How many payments did we miss?" Mason demanded, his voice rising, ignoring the audience of 14 people. "What else are we behind on? What else have you been hiding from me?" The pristine, flawless image Tessa had spent years cultivating shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right onto the china plates. She looked absolutely terrified, finally cornered by the reality she could no longer outrun, realizing she was losing control of the narrative. My mother whipped her head back toward me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "Look what you have done," she hissed, pointing a shaking finger across the table. "You planned this. You came here tonight specifically to humiliate your own flesh and blood and ruin our Christmas." I did not have to defend myself. Aunt Elise calmly pushed her chair back and stood up. She looked down at my mother with a cold, disgusted expression. "Madeline did not ruin this dinner. Diane," Elise said, her voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute authority. The person who speaks the truth does not ruin the family. The person who systematically steals from one child to fund the pathetic, financially illiterate delusions of the other child is the one who broke this family. I reached into my bag, but I did not pull out the thick manila envelope. I did not need to subject the table to an exhaustive audit. I just needed to establish the pattern. I am not going to read you my entire spreadsheet, I said, keeping my voice incredibly even. I will just give you 3 data points. 2 years ago, Mother, you asked me for $3,200 for emergency plumbing repairs. That exact same week, Tessa installed a custom outdoor kitchen. Last winter, you begged for $4,500 to cover a sudden property tax reassessment. 3 weeks later, Tessa bought her luxury imported sport utility vehicle, and last month, you lied about a rotting porch to extract $5,800 from me to keep Tessa's purchase from collapsing before closing. I looked directly at my mother, then at my sister. This ends tonight. My role as your emotional and financial automated teller machine is permanently terminated. Every single line of support is cut. If either of you ever want to have a relationship with me going forward, you will start by admitting the truth. You will stop fabricating emergencies, and you will never, under any circumstances, use my name or my financial stability to cover your reckless mistakes. Diane tried one last, desperate maneuver. She pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes welling with forced tears. "I am your mother," she sobbed. "Blood is thicker than water. How can you treat me like a criminal?" She looked around the table, waiting for the aunts and uncles to rush to her defense, to comfort her and scold me, but the cavalry did not arrive. The silence was absolute. Nobody rushed to pat her shoulder. In fact, Uncle Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Diane," Uncle Robert said slowly, "what about the $2,000 you asked me for last spring? The money you said you needed for a new roof?" My mother froze. Her ultimate power, her ability to control the story, completely evaporated in that single moment. I did not stay to watch the rest of the interrogation. I smoothly pushed my chair back and stood up. Elise did the same. We walked out of the dining room, retrieved our coats from the foyer, and stepped out into the freezing December night. The cold air hit my face, but I did not feel the usual hollowness that accompanied family holidays. I felt incredibly light. I had finally put down a burden I never should have been carrying. A few weeks later, the fallout settled into a quiet, undeniable reality. Mason forced Tessa to sit down with a certified financial planner, brutally auditing every single one of their debts. My mother tried to contact me one last time, offering a half-hearted, manipulative apology hidden inside a request for a small loan to cover her winter heating bill. I calmly refused and blocked her number without a second thought. I sat in the living room of my brick duplex in West Halden. Through the shared wall, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of my new tenant unpacking boxes in the other unit, generating my first month of passive rental income. I held a cup of hot coffee, looking around at the warm lamps and the solid, quiet walls of a property I owned completely. I finally understood the truth. Settling down was never about getting married early or earning my mother's applause. Settling down meant planting my feet firmly on the ground, taking ownership of my own resources, and never, ever allowing myself to disappear from my own life again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and tap the notification bell so you do not miss the next story.